I am excited about the message we have today. And normally this is one of those where it's like, oh, yay, money. And if you were here last year when we were going through our growth paths, and we got to generosity, I just said, look, we're not going to be talking about money. It's going to be about your time and your talents and that sort of thing. And so I know some of you were like, oh, this year, yeah, it's going to be money. So just sit back, relax. You know, this is the kind of message that our treasurer's like, yes, let's go. Let's do this, right? But I wanted to stop and I wanted to go back because I realized I haven't said anything about it since the first week. And some of you are probably still wondering, why in the world did I pick the graphic that I picked and the font that I have for this series? So I want to go back to week 1 where I was talking about when President Kennedy said, hey, we're going to be putting a man on the moon. It wasn't like, hey, we want to put a man on the moon and we're going to do it tomorrow, right? It actually, they had to go, okay, NASA had to go, okay, how are we going to do this? Let's figure this out. And they took some steps forward, they took some steps back, and it took step after step after step of working through all the different programs and all the different ways that they were going to actually put a man on the moon. And so when it comes to our spiritual growth, we need to realize it's not like, hey, I want to be spiritually mature. And you're spiritually mature right then and there. Yes, God can do amazing things and transform us, but there are steps and there's growth that we need to take as we go along. And here's the deal. As Christians, this might not sound as positive as I thought it was going to, now that I think about it. We never come to the end of the path. These growth paths, it's not like you get to the end and go, yay, right? Like at the corn maze last week. So, you know, if you've ever been to a corn maze, there's multiple ways of achieving your goal, right? Now, they give you a map, so you can either choose to use the map or you can forego the map and just wing it, which I don't recommend, unless there's a little hint, just always turn right. And you should be fine. Or you can use the map, and they usually have numbers and different stations that you try to find. And so you can either say, hey, I just want to find all 10 or however many they have, or you can say, hey, I want to go in order, whatever it is, and things like that. So we were going, and we were following the path, and we were doing good, and we found number 1. And then we started walking, and we're like, oh, number 2 is supposed to be right here. Like, oh, well, that's on the other side of this road. So I thought it was here, so we're going to have to back up and backtrack. And it finally got to the point where we're like, hey, we found like 4 or 5 of the numbers, maybe not in order, but now it's just time to get out of this place. And, you know, so it was like, let's go. So I don't even remember where I was going with that story. Anyway, I think it was, you always are constantly following the path. For us as Christians, we always have growth to go. Drop that story. How's that? Fantastic. You guys are like, oh, this is going to be a good day. So, yeah, as you know, we have here at Hillside, we have the 5 growth paths that we talk about, that we want people to be taking steps in. We talked about humility, which I just had a little bit right there. We had reflection. We talked last week about community and the need for community. And today we're talking about generosity. And so, like I said, when it comes to generosity, it's more than just money. And we talked about that last year. And we'll talk more about that throughout the year, of giving of your time, giving of your talents, and that sort of thing. Like our worship team, I mean, they're giving up of their time. They show up early. And it's not just the folks here. It's the folks in back running sounds, running slides. We got people in the stream room. On a Sunday morning, we got people that are working in children's ministry. We've got our greeters. There's all sorts of people giving of their time and that sort of thing. But I really wanted to pause and have a service where we talk about finances. And it's a thing that churches get told, you always talk about money, right? And my response typically is, well, if we always talked about money, do you think anyone would continue to show up? If Sunday after Sunday, all we said is, we need your money, we need your money, eventually people would stop coming. So obviously churches don't always talk about money, but there's kind of that reputation out there. And so what some churches do to combat that is they never talk about money, which I think is really not a great strategy, because God does have a plan and a will for our finances, and so we need to talk about that. And we need to make sure that in our spiritual growth, in our spiritual walk, that our generosity, how we handle our finances, that we're keeping that how God wants us to handle those. And so I want to, before we dive into the scripture, I want to talk about, have you ever gotten into a rut with something? Your morning routine maybe. Every morning you wake up, you might eat the same food for breakfast. You got the same routine when you brush your teeth, when you get dressed, all that fun stuff. Or have you ever done this where you are in such a rut of driving to work that even on a day that you don't have work, you get in your vehicle and you get halfway to work and go, oh my goodness, what am I doing? I don't have work today. Why am I driving to work? Or have you ever gotten halfway to work and went, I do not remember driving the last 5 minutes? I am so glad that I know this route because I'm still, right? It's easy to kind of get in different ruts and routines. If you've attended here regularly, you know I normally do the 3-week test drive spiel. And if you're visiting with us, give us a 3-week test drive, right? That's kind of a routine and all this. When our girls were in school back in Illinois, there was a band director that every concert talked about myelin. Now, myelin is this material that wraps around your nerves, and so the more you do something, the more myelin wraps around, and that's where you get like muscle memory. And so like in instruments, especially, my illustration that I think of is with the trombone. You play the notes enough times, enough myelin wraps around your memory so that your muscle memory, you know exactly where to go for a C or whatever. Trombone amazes me, because I used to think that there were like little notches that you could feel until I found out, no, that's as smooth as can be. I'm like, how in the world do you know where to put the stupid thing to get the right note? Right? For a trumpet, it's like, okay, these different ones, you push down for the note and all. Piano, I know the notes, trombone, right? But it's through this buildup of myelin that you remember things. And every concert, we would get this talk about myelin as if we've never heard it before. And it became a great thing in our house that from time to time, if we would start talking about something, well, what's happening is the myelin is wrapping around, right? And so, but I say that because we do get in ruts and we do get in routines, and stuff just becomes natural for us. My hope is that we become people who practice generosity so regularly that the myelin of our generosity just gets wrapped and thick, that it becomes so second nature to us to be generous, that we're not even necessarily thinking about it. It's just part of who we are. So let's talk about generosity. The passage of Scripture is Matthew chapter 14, 13 through 21. Now, this account is in all the Gospels, and it is slightly, you get different angles from the different Gospels, but we're going to look at Matthew just to read through, but I'm going to reference the rest of the Gospels as well. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, John all have this in there. And it says, when Jesus heard about what happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. Hearing of this, the crowds followed him on foot from the towns. Now, isn't that great? Jesus is trying to get away, and everyone's like, he's trying to get away. Let's go get him, right? But this is how popular Jesus has become. This is how much people are believing in him and really wanting to just hear him and also maybe have someone healed. So, hearing of this, the crowds followed him on foot from the towns. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, He had compassion on them and healed their sick. Here he is. Here's Jesus. He's trying to get away. He just found out that John the Baptist, his cousin, has just been beheaded in prison. And he's wanting to get away. He's wanting some alone time. He's wanting to have that reflection time with God. And the people are just gathering around him, and he has compassion. And his generosity just pours out. And he begins to heal their sick. Here he is trying to mourn his cousin. And what does he end up doing? He's just healing the sick. Now, I've never thought of this before until I started this message, but can you imagine as all these people are coming through with whatever ailments they have, and Jesus heals them. And each time he's thinking, my cousin just died. I had the power. I could have done something. But he's focused on the crowd because he has compassion on them. As evening approached, the disciples, being very practical people that they are, came to him and said, this is a remote place, and it is already getting late. Send the crowds away so they can go to the villages and buy themselves some food. Jesus replied, they do not need to go away. You give them something to eat. We have here only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, they answered. Bring them here to me, he said. And he directed the people to sit on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and 2 fish and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people. They all ate and were satisfied. And the disciples picked up 12 baskets of broken pieces that were left over. The number of those who ate was about 5,000 men, besides women and children. So this is the feeding of the 5,000. There's also the feeding of the 4,000. But here is a story that I want to talk about generosity and just walk through kind of what has happened in this account. So here it is again. Jesus is trying to get away, right? He's trying to get to a remote place. He's wanting to spend some time, maybe recharge, whatever. The crowds are following him. The crowds are like, no, we want to interact with Jesus. We want his healing. We want to hear his teaching, things like this. So he's healing people. And the disciples, what do? Think about this for a second. They're watching Jesus heal people. And instead of going, oh my goodness, he just healed another one. This is amazing. Let's start counting these people that he's healing. No, they're like, are you getting hungry? Yeah, I'm getting hungry too. Is he going to stop at any time? Like, what's going to happen when all these people get hungry? Right? Instead of being like amazed by that, and they come up and they interrupt a healing session, right? They come up to Jesus and they're like, hey, Jesus, it's getting kind of late, and these people might get hungry. And, like the Snickers commercials, people get angry when they get hungry. And so maybe we should just shoo them away. They're asking Jesus to shoo away the crowd that he just landed and had compassion on to heal. But they're so practical, and they're like, how can we feed all these people? And so they're like, why don't we just send them off and let them go get some food? And Jesus is like, nah, I don't think we have to do that. You guys feed them. Now, the Bible doesn't show it. I would love to see it. Wouldn't you love to see? It doesn't say exactly how they approached Jesus and how that conversation went. But I can anticipate the disciples at one point kind of doing a huddle he wants us to feed him. What are we going to feed him with? How is this going to work? What's going on here? Right? And remember, the disciples are normal, regular people. Right? They're not like these spiritual gurus who are like, oh, yes, Jesus, of course, we shall feed these people. Well, no, they are normal, practical thinking people. And so they're like, oh, how is this going to happen? Now, in one of the accounts, Jesus says, well, how much food do we have? Go look and go find out. Right? Can you imagine the disciples? What? Well, go find out how much food. What does he want us to, go do a census? Excuse me, how much food do you have? What about you, right? But somehow they go out and they search, and what happens? Now, it says there's 5 loaves of 2 fish. Now, from another account, it says that all of a sudden this boy comes up and one of the disciples goes, hey, so this guy, this little boy right here, we can steal his food. He's got 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, right? That's it. That's all they find. Think about that for a second. That's all they find. In a crowd of 5,000, that's all the food they find is 5 loaves and 2 fish. That's kind of amazing right there. So, here's this boy. Think about this for a second. Somewhere along the way, the disciples must have come up and said, hey, how much food do you have? Now, imagine you're this little kid, and it's getting dinner time. All right? He might be maybe around teenage age. So, teenage boy likes to eat. He comes up, the disciple comes up to him and says, how much food do you have? And his wheels are probably turning. I could tell him none, and then I could eat this all myself. Or, I don't know, I could give half, right? I don't know what happened, what his thinking process was, but at some point he says, this is all I have. Why is he willing to do that? My guess is he's been watching Jesus. And he's been going, unlike the disciple, he's been going, this is amazing. This guy is healing one after another, all these people. He is simply healing them. And now his disciples are asking about food. Here, what's he going to do with this? You can have it all. Right? So this little boy gave everything he had right then and there to Jesus to say, I know you can do amazing things. Here, you can do more with this than I can. It reminds me of when Jesus was sitting in the temple courts and he's watching people give their offering, right? People are coming in and they're going to the treasury boxes and they're putting in their offerings. And he's noticing all these super wealthy people coming in and putting in their offering. And then he notices this widow who comes up with 2 mites, which is the smallest amount of money you can have in that time. And she has these 2 mites and she drops in her 2 mites, which is barely any cents at all. And she drops it in. And Jesus tells his disciples, that woman has given more than anyone else today. Now think about this. Can you imagine? All right, our offering box is right back there. Can you imagine some Sunday, Jesus comes and sits down and just watches everyone as they give their offering? How intimidating would that have been, right? If you knew who Jesus was and it was time for you to give your offering, I was like, Right. So I was having an interview at a church. I think I've shared this before, but so it was like I've never had to be interviewed by so many people in my life for one job. It was like every time I turn around, they're like, okay, now here's another group of people that we want to interview you. And finally, it came down to the last one. They're like, okay, so here we're going to take you to this clinic where this guy who is big into psychology and a big wig does international speaking and all that. It's his practice, and we're going to go into his practice, and he's going to interview you. And then there's going to be another gentleman in the room during the interview, and his job, basically, he's a human lie detector. And what he does for a living is he's a lawyer and a psychiatrist, and he is like a jury doctor, so he picks juries for high big trials that have a lot of money involved. And so what happens is I sit there, literally, I'm in this room. It looks like a police interrogation room, right? There's this table, and then there's this big window that you can't see out of. And there's people on the other side. I'm like, all the other staff are on the other side of that window watching me. I know that's what's happening, right? And so this guy, bigwig in psychology, has an international practice. He starts asking me all the questions, while Dan, the human lie detector, is literally sitting in the corner, and he's looking at me like this the whole time. And I'm like, how intimidating. Like partway through the interview, my nose itched so bad. And I knew one of the tells of someone telling a lie is if they touch their nose. So I'm like, I can't scratch my nose even though it itches. Because Dan's going to say, he's a liar, right? It's just so intimidating. How much more intimidating would it be if Jesus came and sat here and watched everyone walk through giving their offering? I don't know that Jesus did this, but while he was watching all the people give their offering and then the widow came up, I wonder if as he was watching, I know he knows their thoughts and he knows their hearts. I wonder as he was watching, he's like, oh, that was awesome. Oh, seriously, dude? Seriously? That's what you're giving? Really? Okay, whatever. Oh, good job. Wow, yeah. Oh, come on. Seriously? Just out of obligation? Why don't you just take your money back? What is he thinking as he's watching? And then this widow comes up and drops in, and he says to his disciples, she gave more than anyone else today because he could see her heart. She was being generous. It wasn't about the amount. It wasn't out of duty. It was out of her generosity and her desire and wanting and willingness to give that she gave. And Jesus could see her heart, and he's like, that was generosity. And I think that is probably, as they bring up this boy and say, here's his food, Jesus probably looked at him and said, that's generosity. So what happens? So they take the food, and Jesus blesses it, breaks the bread up into apparently 12 different pieces, right? So he gives it to his disciples, breaks the fish up, gives it to his disciples, and he tells them, now go out and feed them. Now again, the Bible doesn't say, man, I wish it did. Can you imagine, all right, so the 12 disciples again are huddled together. They're looking in their hands going, this is how much food we have. And then they look back at the crowd. You go. No, you go. No. I mean, go out and feed the people. Like, it'd be like, okay, well, those in the first row, congratulations, you get to eat today, right? And it doesn't say what happens, but somewhere along the way, as the disciples are handing out this bread and this fish, somewhere along the way, they must have been going, what just happened? Like, I've been giving out food, and I still have food. I can't get rid of this stuff. It's almost like, you remember those friendship breads that we used to pass around there? That couldn't have been healthy. But, right, it just keeps growing and growing. And somewhere along the way, they must have went from, hey, Jesus, we need to get rid of these people, to, oh, how many more people are here? Let's go. Hey, can we gather some more in? This is amazing, right? Something amazing was happening. And then, once everybody was satisfied and they were done eating, Jesus is like, hey, go collect the extras. And the disciples, again, it doesn't tell us, but I want to believe they're just like, what? Are you kidding me? There's extra? Like, what do you mean there's extra? We didn't have enough to start with, and now you're saying there's extra, and they go around and they collect, and they get 12 baskets full. And you get some people who are like, they want to dive in and find out all these, well, what's the significance of 12 baskets? And, well, there were 12 tribes, and, oh, no, there were 12 disciples. Actually, there were more than 12 disciples. Those were his main disciples. But, hey, and I just want to say, yeah, there was leftovers. That's the significance. Jesus said, look, you give me 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish for over 5,000 people, and I'm going to give you leftovers. Because a little boy had a heart of generosity and said, Jesus, I know you want to feed the 5,000. And if I went on my own with what I have, I couldn't do it. Here, you do it. when we have a heart of generosity, it's not about us. It's not about our glory. It's not about us getting kudos. It's not about us coming up with this great plan of what's going to happen when we give this money. It's simply saying, you know what, Jesus? I know who you are. I know what you've done, and I know what you can do. Here. I want you to do that with this. I want you to accomplish whatever you want to accomplish with this. And it doesn't have to be a great amount. I mean, think about it. 2 of the greatest generous stories in the Bible are about 2 mites and some bread and some fish. It's an attitude. Now, there's a huge debate that happens when you talk about finances and things like that in the church too. There's as Christians, we should tithe. And there's great argument of why we should tithe as Christians, giving 10% of what we make. Then you get into, okay, but do you tithe on the gross or do you tithe on the net, right? And all this wonderful stuff. And you've got some people who can really argue for, yes, Christians should tithe. Then there's the argument of, well, that was Old Testament, and Jesus doesn't teach tithing anymore. Jesus just teaches generosity. And so as Christians, we should be generous and not have to be worried about the legalistic 10%. And people can argue that very strongly as well. You can argue both of those very strongly, and I would say, hey, that's fantastic. I land in this camp. We can never be more generous than Jesus. Jesus is a very generous, extremely generous. God is so generous, as Dan was talking about as we were going through worship. God is so generous with His grace, His love, His forgiveness. We can never be more generous than God. But as Christians, our desire should be to become more and more like God, to follow His character. We were created in His image. And therefore, He looks at us and says, my heart is that your heart would be generous. And as weird as it may sound, coming from a pastor, if you give 10% out of duty and obligation, I would rather you start just giving out of a heart of generosity. If you're just giving out of duty and obligation, then you're just being religious. And Christianity isn't about religion, it's about relationship. You know, we are followers of Jesus as Christians or His disciples. And in New Testament time, during Jesus' time, there was this saying or this blessing, may you be covered in the dust of your rabbi. In other words, may you travel so closely next to your rabbi that as he's walking, the dust would come up and cover you. That's how close you are to him. You are walking in his footsteps. In fact, the idea disciples would follow their rabbi. Jesus wasn't the only rabbi, obviously. There were other rabbis who had other disciples. And the idea is you would follow. You would do what they do. You would say what they say. You would eat what they eat. You try to mimic your rabbi. We are still disciples of Jesus. We should be mimicking. Our heart should beat the same as Jesus. Our heart should be as compassionate as Jesus. Our heart should be as loving as Jesus. Our heart should be as generous as Jesus. Now, Jesus isn't physically sitting here watching us give our offering. But every time you write a check, every time you set up that automatic withdrawal, every time you give to anything, Jesus does know your heart. And my question is, are you giving out of obligation, or are you giving out of generosity and saying, oh, God, I want to see what you can accomplish through this? When I worked for Youth for Christ, I was in Australia for a year with Youth for Christ, and the first thing I had to do with Youth for Christ was raise money to go, which kind of reminded me of when Haley was in Girl Scouts, and her first year in Girl Scouts. The first thing was, okay, well, now you need to try to sell these magazines, and now you need to sell this. And at one point, Haley said, is this all we do at Girl Scouts is sell stuff? Right? And it's like, no, hon, we'll get to the good stuff here in a little bit, right? But the first thing I had to do as being part of Youth for Christ, I had to raise money to be able to go to Australia for a year. And it was a decent amount, because part of it was I needed transportation while I was in Australia, so I needed to go over and buy a car when I got there and all that fun stuff. But in my training, a brilliant statement the guy who was doing the training on fundraising made. He said, look, it's not about trying to convince people to give more of their money to your account, to what you're trying to accomplish. It's more about educating people and helping them to understand the decision they're making isn't how much of their money they're giving. It's how much of God's money they're keeping. And as Christ followers, all of our stuff is God's. And so it's not about how much of my stuff am I going to give. It's more of a, hey, God, how much of your stuff am I going to keep? Now, here's the deal. Generosity is what this is about. I'm not saying that you have to give $1 billion to the church. Now, if you have $1 billion you need to unload, we can talk about it. But I'm saying, when is the last time you had a conversation with God about your finances? Compare that to, when is the last time you had a conversation with God about a need you wanted Him to meet? See, when it comes to finances, we think we're all in, God, whatever. But how often do we actually talk with God about our finances? Man, that hit me hard this week when that entered my brain. I'm like, ooh. I'll raise my hand. I do not have that conversation on a regular basis. It's just not part of my thinking. I don't have enough myelin in that area. But if I'm a Christian, I'm a Christ follower, and I have said, God, all of me, my whole life, I turn everything over to you, that has to also mean the finances you've gifted me with. And so I need to start having conversations. God, I want to be generous. Help me be generous. How am I doing with my finances, with your finances? God, is there an area that you would like me to branch out to and support more? It's an interesting thing, generosity. You can't legislate it. You can't legalize it. Generosity, you aren't generous by following a rule. You're generous by following your heart. So I'll tell you, folks, my prayer is going to be, God, help me to be someone who has a generous heart like yours. Now, it doesn't mean all of a sudden He's going to ask me to give all my money away. But as I ask, God, help me be generous, help me be generous, all of a sudden, I'm going to find more and more opportunities to go, hey, God, let's see what you can do this. Oh, wait, what about this? What can you do with this? Oh, what about this? And every time I give something away, I realize I'm giving it and saying, God, you can do more than I can. You can do so much more than I can with this. Now, I'm not going to say the more you give, the more you'll get back financially from God. I don't follow that theology. The get rich quick by giving to God. Also, I'll tell you, there's people who say, the more you give here, the more the treasures you receive in heaven. And so it's kind of like a weird afterlife investment fund of, all right, I'm investing this so I can be filthy rich in heaven. The little hint, you're not going to care in heaven. So if that's your strategy, Imagine if Hillside was just a group of people who are super generous, who have a very loose grip on their finances and are constantly in conversation with God of, okay, God, how are we doing? How are we doing with those finances? Is there an area? Show me an area that you would like me to be generous with. And it doesn't mean you have to give to everything. But I think as Christ followers, we need to be having that conversation about our finances with our God. So there you have it, folks. Money. Again, I just want to make it clear, it doesn't matter if our offering goes up 300%. My pay does not go up. I'm not doing this to get more finances. I will say this, though. The better the finances of the church, the more ministry that can happen through the church. I'll tell you, man, Thursday at Trunk or Treat, as I'm looking around and seeing all these folks from Hillside, there out in our community, as I'm walking and introducing myself to different teachers, staff after staff after staff, and just hearing them say, man, we love that you guys are supporting us. We love the encouragement. We're so thankful for your partnership. Man, it was so awesome to see people being generous. Generous with their time. Yeah, generous with their finances, because I'll tell you what, trick-or-treat candy isn't cheap anymore. Man. But imagine if we all had the heart of God with generosity, the impact that could be made. So my encouragement to you this week, have a conversation with God. If you're reading Psalms 139, like we've been saying through reflection, and during that time, to say, okay, God, search me, know my heart. Is it as generous as it should be? And some of you, you know what? God's going to say, yes, thank you. Thank you for having a generous heart. Some of you are very generous. Some of us, He might be saying, let's work on that. I'll help you. You'll get there. So this week, have a conversation with God about your finances. If you're married, have a conversation with your spouse, with your family. Say, hey, let's get serious about this. If we're going to say, God, I turned everything over to you, let's turn everything over to Him. Let's pray. God, again, we just thank you for this day, and God, for all of us who are sitting in this room, God, we're blessed to be in a country that truly is, God, we're a wealthy country. God, we're able to come into this building and worship together. God, I just pray, God, give me a heart a generous heart like yours. God, help me to have compassion like Jesus. Help me to have a heart like the widow, like that little boy. To just willingly give to you and say, here you go. You can do more with this than I can. In your name we pray. Amen.